I am so thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this panel this morning, a chance to learn from some of the great leaders in our network, both current and recent school systems leaders. And we're going to start by having them introduce themselves briefly. So you all have access to their official bios, but I'd love for each of you to just share the 2-minute, notice I said 2-minute version of your career arcs. With a little bit of context that we couldn't get from your official bio, so a little extra flavor. Okay, let's start with Lamar.
Oh, you tricked me. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to my friends this morning. My name is Lamar Gorey. I currently serve as superintendent of Caddo Parish Public Schools, which is in Shreveport, Louisiana. The main base is in Shreveport, Louisiana, and we're a parish system. For most of you, it's the same as a county system. So we make up over 900 square miles. Within the system, we're educating and taking care of about 35,000 students today, but that number has been as high as 42,000 within the last 10 years. So we, like many urban systems, are seeing that population decline. We have so much to be incredibly proud of that we've accomplished, especially in the equity space, and especially when you look at the work that we've done to advance the cause for our children of poverty, as well as our Black and brown students within our parish. So we're really proud of that. Now, a couple things that you probably would not have known from my bio. First is that I am better. All right, what I'll say is that I am born, raised, and educated in Caddo Parish Public Schools. Now, I was away for 24 years, went off to college in Georgia, taught in the Georgia community was there about 10 years, but then I returned to Texas, was there for 14 years before I had the opportunity to come home and lead my home school system. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting is that I started off as a slow reader myself, as a kinder first grader. But, you know, a part of my why, when we speak of our why story, is that I was fortunate that both my parents were educated. They were educators actually within Caddo Parish, which is the system I lead. Now, because they were educated and my mother was a trained teacher, she could teach me how to read. So every night, I had that intervention before it was called that. We pre-learned lessons every night before I went to school. And of course, ultimately, they made sure that I got the support that I needed to catch up. And it's just such an advantage for me to have that parent that could navigate the system and work really hard every day to create that opportunity for every child within our school system.
Great. All right, Pat, same question to you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Pat Brantley. I'm the CEO of Friendship Schools in Washington, D.C. We are a network of charters, 15 schools in D.C., just under 5,000 students. My bio starts at my first job after college, which was at Prudential. I am a child of Newark, New Jersey. Prudential was the largest and oldest employer. So getting a job at Prudential was like getting a good government job, right? If you all understand what that means. And so I had a chance meeting with civil rights leader Dorothy Irene Height. Just one weekend I was volunteering. I met Dr. Height and she said, why don't you come to DC and do something important with your life? And I literally packed up my stuff over a weekend. I moved to DC to work in civil rights for Dorothy Height. She introduced me to a man by the name of Donald Hens, who ran a place called Friendship House. I went there to do development programs and other things, and we started Friendship Schools. I did a little bit more work in civil rights, but I went back to Friendship Schools as a COO, eventually becoming the CEO, which I am now. But the truth is, my arc starts much earlier than that. It's just that I only realized that once I was working for quite a while, just more recently. My arc starts at a place called La Casa de Don Pedro, the House of Don Pedro, which is one of the largest Latinx-led social services agencies in the country, and certainly the largest in Newark. It was founded by my stepfather, Ramon Rivera, who was a young lord, and with the young lords in the very early 70s, where we thought about empowerment and self-sufficiency and being the authors of our own liberation, because that's what they talked about a lot with the young lords. And so my first job was as a teaching assistant in the early childhood program. And my second job was writing the hand entries when we had to do all the financial ledgers by hand. And so what I learned very early on, what La Casa taught me, passion, charisma, vision, have to be married to people, operations, structure, and yes, money to create enduring organizations. And I think that was the start of my career arc.
It's a carefully placed cheering section. This is great, beautiful context. Bill.
Same question?
Yes.
I'm just Bill. So as my older sister reminded all of you yesterday, I'm the OG in the room. Not only on the stage, but in the room, right? But I'm in the TBA 05, and I'm currently the president and CEO of an organization that is headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's called KnowledgeWorks. And some people may know KnowledgeWorks from the work that we do currently, which is creating the conditions to personalize the learning experience, to transform a learning experience through personalization and competency-based learning. But some may know KnowledgeWorks from work that it has done in the past in some organizations that have come out of KnowledgeWorks, like Strive. If anyone has worked with the Strive partners, that is an entity that was founded within KnowledgeWorks. Others may know NewTek. NewTek was still another organization that came out of KnowledgeWorks. And so I've been there now for a little over a year. And prior to that, I was a superintendent in the school district of Philadelphia for 10 years. And then prior to the 10 years that felt like 30 in Philly, I was superintendent in Prince George's County, Maryland, where I was first deputy superintendent working with a good colleague and friend, John Dacey, as his deputy, and then became superintendent. And then prior to that, was just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a district called Cobb County. And then before that I worked in my hometown, which was Richmond, Virginia, in a school district that surrounds Richmond called Henrico County. And so interested in having a conversation. My why has become, and John, I really appreciated particularly the story about the why in your children. Now I have 3 grandchildren who are 3 months, 2 years old, and 11 years old. All black boys who will grow up to be black men. And I worry about like the world, the environment to which they will grow and prosper and hopefully achieve. And so that has become my new why. And then, in addition to all of those things, I enjoy and am humbled and very appreciative to be working with Hansu, Colleen, and team at the Broad Center at the Yale School of Management as the superintendent in residence.
Thanks, Bill. I think Bill's family thought he was retiring when he left Philly, but instead we've given him a couple of jobs. So. So I'm curious to hear something that you have accomplished in your time as a school system leader that you're especially proud of. So that chance to highlight something that you've really achieved. What was the impact of what you achieved and why did it matter? And who were some of the people who helped make it possible? Pat, let's start with you.
I'm going to tell you 2, but I'll be brief in the telling. The first is a school called Monument Academy, which was founded to be a school for foster care children, middle school, where it would be residential for those students. It is not a friendship school, so it's not one of mine. But just 2.5, 3 years in, they were put up for revocation because of violence, lack of structure, lack of academic progress. When I first came out of Princeton, I was married for a very brief period of time, although probably not happily, as our speaker of the day said. But during that time, I had responsibility for 2 young girls who were in and out of the foster care system. And I was very young and didn't know how to advocate properly and wasn't able to give them better outcomes, and they sort of stayed in that system. But when I heard that Monument was up for closure, it really meant a lot to my heart. And so I reached out to them and I said, it doesn't have to happen this way. You can stay open. And so I worked with a broad group of people to convince the charter authority that we could restructure it and keep it open. And today, it is considered a strong, stable school for children that are in foster care, whose parents need a break and they need that residential part. And it doesn't have thousands of kids in it, it has a few hundred. But for those few hundred kids, it is making all the difference. And so I'm quite proud of that. The second is a friendship example. And if I don't give you a friendship example back home, they're going to get me. And that is that as we went into the pandemic, Friendship was the only was operating the only public tuition-free online school. And so we had this pandemic, and so while most of our students are brick and mortar, we could leverage what we were doing online. When we were starting to come out of the pandemic and people went back to school, parents of medically fragile children were afraid to send their kids back, but they didn't have options in the schools they were in. And we became that provider. So you could stay with your school, we became that provider. Today we're leveraging that same thing so that middle school students in some of our schools that may be struggling the most, not Friendship schools, outside of Friendship, have algebra and geometry. Because if you don't have that in middle school, you don't go into the selective high schools, and you're probably not on the path for selective colleges. And so I'm quite proud that we are doing what I just consider algebra for all. It doesn't matter where you are, we can leverage our resources to make sure that students have access to it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So I want you to imagine that you just got your first superintendency and you walk into the office and you see that there are 10 schools that are eligible for state takeover. Now, to go back a little bit farther from there, I remember when I applied to become superintendent of Caddo Parish, had seen great success in the state of Texas, had grown a lot, great promotion. I mean, this is the longest job I've ever had, the same title. I mean, because the promotions and progression of my career was really moving fast. But I had this calling to apply to my hometown school system to become superintendent. You know, I remember when I got the job, I was so excited. And I remember Delano Ford, who is Brode, he may be in the room. I remember he gave me a call because he was still with this thing called the Recovery School District. Now, at this time, I hadn't been in Louisiana in 14 years, so I really didn't know what this Recovery School District was. But he said, well, I really need to sit down and talk to you. I said, well, I'll be in Shreveport in a couple of weeks as I transition in. And he's like, can't wait that long. I'm coming to Dallas. So he actually met me in Dallas. So, you know, if I could curse, there's a word I would use after I talked to him. I was like, because what did I get myself into? Nevertheless, came on to Shreveport and saw these 10 schools that were eligible for takeover. And immediately, everyone is asking me, well, what are you going to do? So as you look at the data and you look at how the schools were comparing in comparison to then the about 55 other schools, you'd say, well, give them to the state. Maybe they'll do a better job. But that was not an option because that's not what I was hired to do. So when I think about legacy work and when I think about things that I pray that people remember, I pray they remember what we did as a team for those 10 schools. We immediately went into partnerships with the state. And at this time, the board had this totally adverse relationship with the state. And we broke down those barriers and we began to build those relationships so that we could get those resources that were best for those students. We built the transformation zone and we saw amazing results. We changed the trajectory of those students. And when you think about this transformation zone, I think the thing to remember more so than the schools having F labels on them, this was about 6,000 students, all of color and 99% of poverty. So not only did we change a grade on a building, more importantly, we changed the trajectory and the life opportunities for all of those children. Now, when I think about people that helped me, the community was amazing. The state was amazing. But I think that they were only amazing because of a collaborative arm that we presented to them. It was not a us against you mentality. I would be remiss, though, and I don't just say that because my Mary's in the room, but I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that when I interviewed, there was this 27-year-old pregnant reporter with the Times who had been very aggressive in her reporting around what was wrong with the school system. She was an education reporter, but we were drawn together as I interviewed, and she's one of the first people that I went after to hire. Now, a lot of people would say, why would you go hire the news person that has been so aggressive in her reporting against the schools? Well, it was because she was telling the truth, and more importantly, she had the heart for the system and for the children. So I publicly thank you, Mary, for all that she's done, even as I'm sitting on this stage to make my life easier. Thank you, Mary.
Mary, go girl. Lamar, nice shoes, bro.
Thank you, man.
Nice shoes.
I learn from the best. You inspire me always.
I was trying to think of just kind of one thing, and because you usually think of all of the things that you missed, right? And the things that were left unaccomplished or you still had work to do. And so when I just saw the questions, and it's like, oh, the thing that was successful, but there were quite a few, and I'm trying to boil them down to the things that mattered the most. And for me, the thing that matters most is always when a young people have an opportunity to succeed, and then they succeed because of that opportunity. And I think about and this kind of builds to the conversation that was yesterday afternoon in the Shaker Heights. We had a system in Philadelphia where, although we educated between district and charters about 200,000 children, children who were identified gifted were concentrated in one or two areas of the city. And then we started asking the question, well, why is that so? Because it was the adults in the system who were making recommendations about the children who may have qualified for gifted services. And so one of the things that we did against a lot of yelling and screaming was to create a structure where we used a nonverbal cognitive assessment and gave it to everybody. Mm-hmm. And then that next year, 2 children who scored in the Mensa category, one was an undocumented student in North Philadelphia in the Kensington area, if you know Philadelphia. And the other one was a child that was in North Philadelphia on the other side of Broad Street, where there had never been a child who was identified for gifted services. And I think about the mechanism that we put in place in order to give those young people access. And then the other thing I would just share is that we increased dramatically. And when I got to Philadelphia, and one of the reasons I went to Philadelphia was because they were under, at the time, state control. And so there was a lot of consequences and negative aspects of being under state control. One was you had to depend on the legislature, the legislative body, who wasn't particularly friendly to Philadelphia or to Pittsburgh. And it was a very conservative approach. And so you had to depend on the legislature. But the one benefit was that they had 5 commissioners who were some of the most professional people I'd ever had the opportunity to work with. And at the time, I was working with people in Prince George's County. If Latifah is here this morning, she'll understand what I'm talking about. And when the craziness that was happening with board members that were questioning things that were so just kind of small and minute. And I'm just any opportunity I have to get away from these crazy ass people, I'm taking it. So got to Philadelphia, commissioners, understanding all of the hard things we had to do, and we had to do some really hard things. We were facing a $1.5 billion revenue shortfall, wondering if we were going to be able to make payroll moving forward. And so you needed that structure in order to do many of the hard things that we had to do. But there's one particular thing that happened recently that reminded me of the product of all of that work. And because all of that work included things that none of us want to do that are really hard. We had to close schools. In fact, I got there in October. December of that year, I recommended closing 39 schools. So we didn't close 39, we closed 24. Shortly thereafter, we laid off 20% of the workforce. If you do the numbers, that's about 5,000 FTEs. 4,000 of those positions were filled by people. Then to make matters worse, we had to open school the following year with just teachers and principals. And if a school was lucky enough to have a nurse, that nurse stayed there, but we had no secretaries, no guidance counselors, no individuals to monitor halls. And so all of that to say, one of the things I'm most proud of is bringing that district, after getting there at that point, back to local control, where individuals were representative of the city of Philadelphia, so the city of Philadelphia could actually provide the support that was needed for the resources that were needed in order to educate children. And the thing that allowed us to get back to local control was, people talk about the fiscal stuff, but the things that I'm most proud of was the increase in the children who were graduating, the increase of the children, the representation of children from all across the city who were now receiving different services because we had identified them for those services. And the fact that one of those young people who was in the district at that time, he graduated from Constitution High School. And he graduated from Constitution High School, and I wrote a letter for him to get into college. And I recently wrote another letter for him because he's a director at Knowledge Works. And he's a graduate of the School District of Philadelphia who is now a director in the organization that I operate, and he's going back to school to get his doctoral degree, and he asked me to write a recommendation for him. And what was nice was using the recommendation I wrote for him as a high school student as the basis for that talking about that information in order for him to get into a program. And so one of the things that, and I remember walking around the city of Philadelphia, driving through the city of Philadelphia, and just thinking, why did I come to do this work? I don't think it can be done. As a matter of fact, we still had a house in Maryland, and we didn't sell that house until my third year in Philadelphia. We didn't sell a house because I knew I was going to go back. And if you ask people who were there, they will tell you now, we were betting on how long he would stay. But then after you do all of those hard things, and you have a system, and you look at a community of individuals who are saying, okay, you did all of the things you said you were going to do in order to put us in a position to get better. Now, who would I have been to walk away from the opportunity to make them better? And one of the things I'm most proud of was all of the things that we were able to do to bring that system back to local control. Although now they got a crazy-ass school board too, but I mean, go figure. But all of the other aspects of that worked really well.
So as you all know, our theme for Forum this year is around the power of together. And there's so much in your roles as CEO and superintendent that are about bringing folks together in different ways. And you've already started to talk about some of the key partnerships that enabled this work, the coalitions you were able to build. So I'd love to hear about some different aspects of how you have brought folks together. Bill, we're actually going to start with you again. I'd love to just hear a little bit about your approach to building teams within the School District of Philadelphia when you were there.
Yeah, I think, so I just talked about some of the context of the school district when I arrived, and so unfortunately couldn't hire anybody. Is when I got there. I took three people who went with me from Prince George's County, and then had one individual who was working at McKinsey at the time, and I convinced or tricked or did something to make sure that person came with me as well. But this is something that I learned early on. As a matter of fact, when I was in Prince George's County, and it's interesting, this question was on there. Colleen and I were talking about this yesterday. And we were talking about this because we were talking about all of the individuals who were on my team, who were a part of my team in Philadelphia, who are now doing other things and leading like state agencies. They are superintendents. Reggie McNeil is like one of the secretaries of general services in PA now, and he was an operations guy in Philadelphia. And one of the things I learned early on when I was a deputy superintendent in Prince George's County, and some of you may know a guy who then was he was serving as a mentor, and I always use him as a soundboard. And he started at Aspire Schools, Don Shalvey. And Don would always talk about things like people would complain about meetings, like we meet too much and we spend too much time sitting in meetings. And Don was the kind of person that says, like, we are people organizations, and people have to interact and communicate, and like meetings are the means to do that, right? But one of the other things he said was that we were just taking for granted that if we posted positions and people met the qualifications of that position, they would be sufficient. They would be a sufficient resource for the organization, and that's not necessarily true. And so one of the things that Don said was that talent is, as a leader, one of your most important jobs. And just kind of cultivating talent, attracting talent, retaining talent. And he was asking, because I was over schools at the time, and he was asking, Bill, how much time do you spend on that? Like, well, once I write the job description, I give it to other people and then they hire. And he said to me that he spent about 75% of his time on talent. And so one of the things that I think was really important in Philadelphia, once we were able to begin developing a team, a vast majority of my time was spent on talent and attracting talent, building talent, retaining talent, supporting talent, learning from talent. And I think so the byproduct of that was like a tremendous team of individuals who not only helped to change the dynamics of the system in Philadelphia or in Prince George's County or other places where I've worked, but now have gone to lead like different systems and organizations. And as a matter of fact, the most recent individual who ran their Office of School Safety just became the police commissioner in the city of Philadelphia, as an example. And so it's through making a commitment and focusing on like those things that as an organization will help you build and develop and sustain like your mission and what you're trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Pat, you have talked about bringing people together not only within your network at Friendship, but across the charter sector in DC, which can have a lot of independent-minded folks. So sometimes getting folks to row together can be interesting. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about that aspect of your leadership, an example of what that looked like.
I mean, obviously, being CEO of Friendship, advocacy for friendship is one of my main things that I have to do. But what I've realized is that what is good for schools, students, and education is often always what is good for friendship. So I look for alignment in terms of what is good. I look for people that want to collaborate, and that often means I have to go outside of friendship. In fact, I would say within DC, we do a lot of that, but I just want to say something. DC, the DC metropolitan area, the DMV, which part of it is bordered by Prince George's County. I wish that at some point I could have been successful to get the leader of Prince George's to understand that if you're closing schools, sir, you have just depleted all of our teaching staff. Give us a heads up. But in any case, I think that within DC, when I think about that, I would have known today now to call you. Some didn't. But for the work that we have to do means that we need people to think of education, to have goodwill toward education. When a school fails, whether it is a traditional public or a charter, we are all painted with, sort of the dark brush. When one school achieves, people often want to say it's them, they're special, and everybody else is not. So an example that I would give about thinking about coalition building, but more so about convening power. And I think we all have that, and you just have to look around and see who should convene. Prior to the pandemic, DC was considered one of the fastest growing urban districts in reading and math performance. And we had sort of this year after year upward trajectory of performance. And then the pandemic happened. And while we are seeing some rebound in reading in ELA, math is at it's 20 years ago what the performance was. And so I started asking around, people like, y'all are telling us that we need to buy, curriculum that is proven to be effective. Well, we're all using, there are 3 curricular programs in DC. All of them proven, and almost all schools are using them as I'm talking to people. We all might be bemoaning whether or not teachers are prepared, but whether or not you're certified by the district, so I said the criticism of charters. Every charter I know is hiring people that have bachelor's degrees, have experience, and et cetera. And so I realized there's a problem in math. There's no science of math like there's the science of reading. And so I just called on people and said, we need to have a citywide summit on math. And it's shocking the number of people that have shown up across all types of school governance. So we've got the deputy mayor for education, the state superintendent, charter schools, DCPS, that are going to come together. We will release a report on Pi Day of the state of math in the district. And a month later, we are going to have an all-day summit, which is going to be what are the systems level changes that we need. It's going to be greatly informed by teacher voice. But I think in terms of systems, because teachers don't always decide what curriculum they use, how many minutes they have for math, how they're even hired, what the intervention programs are. But I want to come out of that by placing a big bet about, let's just all agree. We're going to improve math performance 10 points each year for the next 5 until we bring DC back to being the fastest improving urban district in math across this country. And that is something that I think is the convening power, because we are all struggling with the same problem. And we all jointly can come up with solutions that are there. And beyond that, DC becomes the hub for the science of math that I hope you all are going to come and see us and help to contribute to creating a science of math movement in this country.
So Lamar, as superintendent in Caddo Parish, I know you've thought really deeply about your role, not only in leading the schools, but the community. And you spoke about this and it being your home community, I imagine. It's even more special. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about your approach there and maybe an example of what that's like.
Right. When I call myself the hybrid superintendent, I think of myself as a superintendent who was born, raised, educated there, but I went away and had an opportunity to learn some different aspects of leadership. And, I came back and my goal was to be successful there. We think about the trajectory of a superintendent tenure, we're looking at 3 to 5 years. And my goal was to outlive that. And I'm just proud that I sit here today in my 10th year in this urban setting. Now, I do think, when I look at how that happened, I do believe my sincere love from the bottom of my heart for the community played a huge part in that. When you think about a community, this is a community where both my siblings, my wife is from this community, all 3 of her siblings, her parents, my parents, all live in this community. So when I lead here, I'm not the superintendent that will just leave and move to another city and never hear about this again. I have to remember that my family goes to church with these people. So it's important that I make a connection and an impact that's meaningful to the community. I do believe that too has been my superpower with surviving in this urban setting with 12 board members, all elected from single member districts in a very segregated system. So these board members bring 100% agendas that are different to the table. I do believe my ability, though, to be able to go into the community, because this is my community, because many of the people in the system, many of the preachers, the leaders I went to high school with. So my ability to pull those together to work toward this common goal of what's best for children has been very powerful. I will not sit here and tell you it's been easy, because, again, people do come from so many different perspectives. But I do believe the lessons I've learned with just caring from the bottom of my heart. When we think about school closures, I've closed some 12 schools in my tenure there, and there is those are days of your life that you don't get back. And when I think about holding the hand of an older person who was upset because their school was being closed, and they just sat there at the school in front of it just crying and crying with them, but more importantly, helping to pick them up and walk them forward and show them and make something better happen for children, and be able to constantly communicate that better as a reason why why this had to happen has been very powerful. So I'm so blessed that I get to lead a community that I love so dearly. And I do believe that's helped me change trajectory for children.
I'm going to ask one last question of the panel, and then we'll open it up for the audience. So please be thinking of the questions you might want to raise. You can direct them to a particular person or to the group as a whole. But my last question for you is, I'd love for you to tell us about a time when a group or community, whether it's a formal or informal, came together for you in a moment when you needed it. And Lamar, let's start with you.
You know, this is a great one for me. You know, I believe in failing forward. I believe that there is a wonderful lesson in every opportunity that you don't succeed. And I think you have to look at failure that way. You know, I remember I had been in Texas for, 14 years, had led in a large school system. There I was in Fort Worth, I was in Mansfield schools. And when I returned home, I was faced with schools that the average age was 75 years old. Now, if any of you have driven through suburban Texas, where my last tenure was, you know that they're building schools that look like colleges. So I had actually opened a school in 2004. So when I came back, my running joke was that my children had never, my personal children, my two children, had never gone to a school where they had to flush their own toilet. So I didn't understand why they didn't have auto toilets there. And it was just kind of a running joke. But nevertheless, I came in the first year there, I decided that I was going to do this huge bond program. It was called Reimagine Caddo. It was huge. It was a bond program. We were going to, of course, toilets was not in the bond, by the way. But nevertheless, we were going to modernize all of the science labs so that they were brought into, to the 21st century. We were going to build new schools. It was just a huge plan. It was going to right-size the entire district. Now, what I did not do is I did not go to the community. I did not create authentic engagement of anybody. It was just my good idea, and because it was mine, it was a great idea. I learned so much from that experience when we talk about failing forward. And I learned from that experience, it was that as we did our next bonds, and I passed 7, with the last, by the way, passing in the 80 percentile rate in a community where the conservative population definitely votes. So when you get in the 80s, that's really good in Louisiana. But it's because of the people that stepped up for me. But it's because I went to my business community. I went to my pastors. I went to the district PTA, and I built authentic relationships. So they step forward for me every day. One thing I'll share is that a superintendent that had served before me, who had gone on to serve as the mayor of our city, as well as state superintendent, interim superintendent in the state of Louisiana, she told me that the board will like you one day and not like you the next day, but it's your community that will always be able to protect you. Always make sure that you build those alliances within the community where when the board is going astray, you have someone who they do believe in that can step up for you. And it's just so proud of what I've done in the relationship space with building those relationships where my community steps up for me all the time.
Pat, same question to you, and it could be either personally or professionally that folks have come together for you in a moment you needed it.
So at Friendship, people often say friendship is family, so I feel like people show up for me every day. But when I was becoming the CEO, was the year that I was turning 50. And so what happened was the man that I had worked with, who we call the founder of Friendship, for over 20 years, was retiring. I was becoming the CEO, and at the same time, the chief of staff that I thought would become the COO decided that she wanted to go out and do her own passion project. So I lost the bookends of my life. At the same time, my 3 oldest friends died within 4 months of each other of cancer. But it was also the year that I started Broad. And so I don't even know that the group that I had in Broad really realized how they just became the steady parts of my life that I needed. And also the examples that I needed as a person who is a very happy second. I was COO, tell me what you want, aim me at a problem, I'm going to go do it. And now I've got to follow this very charismatic, curmudgeonly, say whatever you want person into this role of CEO without having him as my bookend and without having my chief of staff. But what I had was Sheila Briggs, who is all things that you would believe is the good and positive of a social justice warrior, right, of an ally. And, you know, Desmond, who's over there, who is just smooth, right, when he walks in a room, and Marie, and I could name each of them in terms of showing me what it was to walk in different ways in this work, so that when I was somewhat depleted because I lost all of my bookends, I could reflect something back to the friendship community that they needed, right? To be charismatic, to be on stage, which is something I didn't want to do. If y'all had a Valium, that's what was going to get me up on that stage. You know, to stand up when things weren't right. I'm just thinking about feeling that. To do all those things. But also today, though, right? Because I've gotten past that. When I think about my work in DC, I'm not seeking out people because they are Broad, but often the people that I seek out are because Broad saw something in them and they're Broad. So our state superintendent is a Brody. Louis Farabee, who was in my cohort, who is the chancellor. I can always call on Susan from KIPP, I think she's here, Allison from KIPP. You know, not that we talk every day, but hey, you closing schools, what are you doing? What are we gonna do about this problem? And so I think that there is something in this community in particular where what you saw in us is what draws us to each other and helps to fuel our work. Like, that to me is the powerful, I don't know, just co-conspirators that I have, even if I didn't know that that was it from the beginning. And so that's the community that I have and that I'm grateful for.
Thank you. Bill?
Same question.
Yep.
And it's
So tell us about a time when a group or community, whether formal or informal, showed up for you in a moment that you needed it.
Thank you. And I would double click on what both Lamar and Pat have shared. And one thing I want to emphasize, and I think is important to re-emphasize, is this notion of the power to convene. And thinking about that from like a responsibility of leadership. And many of us, and I know I used to think about it when I was new to the superintendency, about like how big of a grant could I attract, or what's my new initiative, or how many people I can get to spend money or invest in the district. And I thought less about how do you actually create the opportunities and the power to convene individuals that will be able to help you when things got tough. And so coming back to the question, I think I would like through this whole process, and I had a team that I could rely on, and the team would always come together, and they were always worried about me, right? And I was always worried about them because I was talking about how important talent was, and didn't want them to become disenchanted with like a lot of the noise, the energy around it, and some of the public events that we had, particularly around the school closures, were really hard. And I remember a staff member who was from the community, because I was relatively new, and I just saw her shut down in the meeting. And so I was always worried about my team, so I would put myself out a lot more. But it was the team that showed up for me in ways that if not for them, I probably would not have made it through some of the tough things that we had to navigate. And and it wasn't so much like, what are you gonna say? What are you gonna do? But it was like, take a breath. How are you doing? And then the other person, and Barbara knows this person well, it's my wife and my spouse, and who convinced me to actually move. We actually had hard conversations about like moving to Philadelphia, and finally we came up with that together. And she's from the Bronx, New York, but that has nothing to do with it, I'm convinced. But she would politely like call people off. Like if we're out having dinner and someone wanted to talk about, like, you recommended my school be closed, she's like, hey, you know what, I'm so sorry. But we were having a conversation about like our grandkids or something, but she would call them off in a nice way. But every now and then, she had to like call them off in a different way. And it was like a pub that I used to go to, and I remember talking to Kaya about this because she's like, get a pub, make sure you can always go to this. And it was, we lived in an area of Philadelphia, it's called Washington Square, and then right around the corner was this bar, and I would always go to this bar. So after the vote of the school closures, my wife, one of my team members, we met over there just to it was a meeting that went hours. People were screaming and shouting. You had like all these police on horses, like, because they were worried that people were going to start rioting. And so I get to the pub, and there's a guy that's always there, and he had just come back from a trip, and he kept wanting to show me pictures of his trip. So he came over and he's like, I want to show you this. Bill, it's good to see you. And I don't even know if he knew what I did, but he was see me in there. So he wanted to talk. And so I was just like, man, if this guy comes over here one more time. So he came over one more time. He's like, one more group. I just want to show you one more set of pictures. And my wife said, you know what? We will look at those pictures if you promise not to come back over here. And the guy turned beet red and went back. And I told my wife that, like, every time after that I'd go to the bar, he would not even look at me. Right. So, but a spouse that could like stand in the brink, and we didn't talk about stuff that happened at school. I mean, hard stuff. We didn't talk about it, but she knew it was occurring. But someone or some support mechanism that literally has your back when it feels like the world is caving in on you. I mean, and I think that became a massive support system for me. And then one other, because you talked about the state superintendent, but it was, the other person was the mayor. The mayor, that was the mayor when I got to Philadelphia. He also became a strong support. He was always worried about, like, how you feeling? You sold your house in Maryland yet? Right. But he was always as interested in just kind of how I was doing as he was in the work.
All right, questions from the audience. We've got a couple mic runners. Let's start up here.
Thank you. My name is Madison Gould. I'm TBR 1921. My question's primarily for Dr. Height, though I'd love to hear from anyone. Dr. Height, I'm a parent in Philadelphia, future parent of the school district of Philadelphia. I'm an educator in Philadelphia. And something I think about a lot, I talk to a lot of other parents a lot, is the role of parents and the advocacy we do for our own children in sort of deepening the segregation of our city in terms of outcomes for students, the roles of like friends of committees, us investing economically in our schools, and then often at a certain point divesting from the city by moving to the suburbs or moving into private education. I'm interested in what push you would give to parents to use their influence more equitably for all children across the district, as opposed to, I don't know if this is me, just our own children, in a way that acknowledges the fact that the outcomes for all kids are best for individual students. And if you have any reflections about how that played into outcomes during your tenure.
Yeah, a lot. So at first, it was almost on a continuum. Thank you for your question, and thanks for your work. I don't know if you're teaching in the school district or at a...
I work in the charter sector.
At the charter sector. Oh, that's in the district?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. I feel that way. I feel that way.
I mean, so they're public schools. Right. And so thank you for your work. And so it was on a continuum. And when I first arrived in Philadelphia, the continuum was to get individuals back into like their community, because the divestment was they just were like choosing out of like schools in general, and not just, they were choosing out of the district, and then they were going to charters or private, or like paying to do something else, or in Catholic schools, parochial schools at the time. So at first, on that arc, when I first arrived, we were just trying to get individuals invested in the schools within their communities, and schools in and around certain areas and I remember meeting with groups of parents, and it was like when the Friends of groups started. And I would encourage them before, like and I was meeting with these young groups, young people who wanted to stay in the city, and I was encouraging them, like before they were even married, to get into the school in their neighborhood and hear from the principal what they're trying to do, talk about what they feel is needed. And so the Friends of groups begin to form, particularly in certain areas of the city, and then it became very powerful in those areas, where so much so that they were then raising money, building these structures, and those schools were able to offer things that other schools couldn't. And so then people would want to move into those areas. Excuse me. I'm not getting choked up, I'm just like.
There's water.
Because I think, and people wanted to move into those areas to be a part of those things, right? And so the one thing that we wanted to do was then create that agency across families who weren't necessarily in those areas. And so try to begin training individuals how to do that in areas where individuals may not have had the same means, and then trying to create in-school structures that were inviting, where people felt like they belonged and they could actually provide some feedback and support. Now it has like evolved into like haves and have-nots. And one of the things that I could say I did, a lot of these things have been walked back, but some of the things that we tried to do almost on my way out was to create like central structures that became a guardrail for equity. And I didn't want school-based decisions around who gets to attend. That needed to be central, because if we were saying there's a set of criteria, then I didn't want someone given exception simply because they knew the person or the person worked at Penn or something else. So what we were trying to do was just to then begin building like internal structures that would have or create those guardrails around everyone having access. And then the other thing, like Penn Alexander is a school, and people who are not in Philadelphia is a school that is right, it sits right almost on the University of Pennsylvania's campus. And the University of Pennsylvania actually invested in the school, so much so that they were providing $1,000 extra per pupil. And that school was then able to offer things that then our high-performing schools would use as their criteria, so they could only get kids from Penn Alexander. So then when Penn came back and said, we would like to do more for Penn Alexander, then I was saying, no, I need you to do more for schools in North Philadelphia, or schools in West Philly, or schools in South Philly, not just the school that sits in your neighborhood. And as a result, they actually were making an investment in facilities, as opposed to just creating like that one location. of a high-performing school. But I think, once again, it's the power, using the power and influence to convene individuals, to bring them to the table, to help solve this issue. One of the reasons we changed the structure of how schools would decide on who would attend their schools, these are special admission schools, or lottery-based, or magnet schools, was a group of parents who said this is inherently unfair if you don't live in the 5 schools that traditionally feed this high-performing school. And guess what? They were right. Like, to your reporter thing, they were right. It's like, help us create another structure or system, and I think that's the thing that you can do. And then other than that, you get into things like funding equalization. Those things are much harder. But at least in Philadelphia, we try to create the capacity of individuals to garner and display agency and participate in agency around that particular school.
Thank you.
Sharika.
Good morning, Sharika Bolden, TBM 2223, and I really just kind of want to stay with this topic of sitting in the seat as system leaders and this topic of community engagement and extend it a bit further. I am a parent in the public school system, a school district employee, a community leader. Yep. And I'm thinking about what Hansel said yesterday in terms of the role of system leaders not being well understood and being understudied. And so I'm at a point actually where I am selecting my doctoral focus. And I'm interested from your perspective. I appreciated hearing the heart that each of you have for the community. But what is it that you would want the public or policymakers or media or community leaders to know about what gets in the way when you're sitting in the seat as a system leader and you have a heart for the community, but what gets in the way of that? Or what is it that you would want to be understood or studied better about how we can work together to make the vision that you all have to come to life around working with the community?
You know,
I can give you mine. You want this one?
Thank you. I'm glad you were close. So one thing I'll tell you is that I think we have to understand, and one thing I've learned from this seat is that when you sit in this seat, by virtue of you work for a board, there is going to be a diversity of thought. One of the quickest way to not survive in the superintendent CEO seat is if you believe that only your ideas are the only correct ideas and the only way to move systems forward. I think when you authentically engage with the community, whether that's parents or whether that's business members, whether that's just your average citizens, you have to have an appreciation for their perspective, because people oftentimes are not bringing a different perspective to be difficult. They're bringing a difficult perspective because their experiences have been different and the way they receive and own that is different. The challenge of this role, the challenge of this seat is being able to bring those perspectives to a space where you can move forward in the work. Now, one thing I want to comment on when we speak to parents, and I do believe we've done quite a bit of research in our parish because we're such a diverse parish with such diverse performing schools. But one thing that is consistent in every high performing school, and that's even our schools of poverty, is that there is a high level of engagement of parents. So it is our responsibility as leaders to find a way to engage authentically those parents so that they can play that vital role in the education of their children, which ultimately moves our system forward.
I want to address it very quickly. What gets in the way? It is the lack of shared knowledge and real information and facts about what is happening in schools. So we have a whole lot of electeds who make policy or resource or other decisions, and these people are now taking their information from tweets and somebody who's giving testimony for 2 minutes, but it may not be based on data. And so I'm going to just, your example about who's getting, which 5 schools are sending kids to the application schools. There's an idea in DC that in order to stabilize the enrollment of schools that are declining, then you need to standardize grades so that all middle schools start at 6th. So I'm in a boundary and student assignment committee, which is mostly about the traditional schools. And I say, babe, that's probably great. Can you give us the data on how many kids are in standalone middle schools going to these application schools versus those kids that are in middle frameworks that started much earlier, so they had access to higher level math while in middle school? Anti-charter DCPS parents were like, hold on, wait a minute. She's right about that, because my child's not getting the math they need, and they're not even being considered for the application schools. So how do we put the data and the facts out in front of electeds and other people that are making decisions so that they're just not going off of someone's soundbite? Because you could say anything at the microphone, right? And that's a part of the problem, because they're creating policy that's not based on good, solid facts. I would say the other part of that is we have to have parents, send that message, because they don't want to believe me or you or et cetera. They want to believe the other people that are there. And then what are we asking schools to do? I can't solve crime in the community, but I have to address it in the school. And so almost all things that are about solving things for youth are about, let's have the school do more. And people are like, well, why your budgets? You're spending so much in DC. Because I now have a whole clinical team, a violence interruption team, that is about half the size of my teaching staff. And the resources have to go somewhere. And so I think we're asking schools to do a lot that needs to be done in the community. But thank you for the question.
Just want to build on a point, and you. So, Pat, as you were answering that question, you reminded me of Howard, who unfortunately couldn't be here, Howard Fuller. And I remember when Howard came to talk to the last cohort. One of the things, Howard drops all these jewels in addition to his playlist, right? So, but he drops all these jewels, but people were asking him about this notion of engagement, right? And Howard was like, and he responded, and this is his response: everybody don't need to be at the table. Like, you don't need everybody at the table. You need the people who matter at the table. And like, if you're talking about children in the community, you need those families and parents at the table. I don't need like the 5 women who retired, white women who retired from the school district that used to work there 20 years ago, establishing like the framework for policy. So I just wanted to also remind us that it's those individuals who are representative of the communities you're trying to serve. They are the ones you need at the table.
Another question. Let's go to the back of the room.
So I want to stay kind of in that family parent lane. Working early childhood and education, and I'm working with a lot of nonprofits, philanthropy in Memphis, and we're doing a lot of family-facing programming. And one of the ways I've convinced them to participate in it is because a lot of times we talk about children being poor, and I personally believe children live in poverty, but their parents are poor, and we really care about Black and brown people until they turn 18. And so we're engaging with a lot of parents who live in an economic system that has no hope for them. And so you talk about closing of schools. Every time we close a school for a child, that's a community of adults who don't have economic opportunity, right? And so your opportunities that you've had in superintendencies, have you had opportunities to engage with the economic forces in your communities, your chambers, your mayors, and what are some thoughts you have on that, or some successes you may have had trying to change economic conditions around outside of your schools, because we know we can't get to our kids, get the movement we want unless we work through their parents.
One thing I'll say, and we've closed quite a few schools as well, and it's when I talk about time you won't get back, a lot of what you describe is a space that you lose sleep over, because there is this belief, and it's some truth to it, that the school is a central hub of so many communities, especially when you're in large urban communities, and that as that school goes, so does that community. Now, I think the reality there is there are a lot of things that happen in that community to create the decline that the school is being closed to address, and that's just a fact. that. But nevertheless, that's not the way that's perceived. One thing that we've looked at, though, in our community, and we've looked at this, and we're getting close to being successful in this movement about, if I'm going to take away this school, what am I going to give this community? What can I show this community that you're going to receive now? And an example, a simple example would be looking at closing 3 small schools, but yet building a brand new school in that community, and really bringing the community around that new school and the focus of that new school and what it could mean in that space for the community. Now, one thing that I'll quickly share, and that's just one example though, is that one thing that we've learned too when we look at poverty and really how are we supporting children that are being raised in poverty was around this whole notion of kindergarten readiness, which we spoke to with literacy. So when we started our literacy agenda, and we all know how important it is to learn to read so that you can read to learn, but when we started our literacy work, I wanted to backtrack and let's look at pre-K. Let's do this notion around universal pre-K. Now, when I looked at universal pre-K, I saw that there was actually pre-K seats available, but then I was more concerned with the age of 0 to 3. We have worked very closely with our community around this whole notion of what are those words, those, you know, you hear about the 30 million word gap that students have to acquire some knowledge of words by 3, or they lose it for life. So that was a space that truly scared me. And then we looked at what's going to happen and how are we going to create more students that are raised in poverty, not to become impoverished adults. We've got to address that space of 0 to 3, and we've done a lot in our community, working with partners in the community around how are we making sure that those young mothers and young families, I should say, not just mothers but families, how they have exposure to what needs to happen in the lives of those children from 0 to 3, and just super excited about the work that we're doing in our community in that space. And we're starting to see more prepared, more kinder-ready students that are living in poverty, and we know that that's going to continue to positively affect our literacy rates, and we will see that in the future, we'll see more students that were raised in poverty not grow up to live in poverty.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Russ, Chief of Schools, KIPP Nashville. Just spilled my water, it's fine. I'm curious to learn more about the science of math work that you talked about. I think that is something that everybody jumped on the science of reading train. We're doing dibbles and MClass and everything under the sun, and that's great, but math is something that we are really trying to get to the bottom of. So curious about the format of the summit that you're running and any way that we could be helpful in trying to just get some of the foundational data to help support the work that you're doing there. So just curious about just the layout for that summit.
Sure, absolutely. I will make sure that the report that we put out is available to everyone. We know that in the science of reading that if students don't have a good grasp of phonics, that there are just these things that they have to have. Well, in math, it's number sense, being able to make sense of it, how you put it together, how it comes apart. And so there has been the start of some of this research. The problem in math, one of the problems in math is, think about it if you run schools and the leaders that you have. Almost anybody can walk into an ELA classroom and ask a kid questions and see whether or not they can answer them for their higher order thinking, what they're writing, and diagnose that. That's not true in math. So there's a leadership gap about how to have great math classrooms and math instruction. There is a gap in students or young people who are coming out of institutes of higher education, I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know. Conceptual knowledge of math teachers is not quite where it needs to be. And so higher ed has to step up, right? And for our state superintendencies and for the agencies, you have to do more to give micro-credentials to teachers, right? In terms of building, this is a teacher who actually can teach. I've had teachers who come in, you're teaching math and you're telling me you're struggling with the number line. I mean, it's a problem. So there are many things that I think we can come to together, but all segments of our community, higher ed, teacher preparation, leadership, have to come together to be a part of it. And I'm also hoping that the business community is going to come together and say, you're not going to come work at Amazon, Google, et cetera, if you don't have these skills. And so they have a vested interest in helping our high schools reshape themselves so that students are ready to go into some of this employment. And if I could just, on the poverty question, we are thinking, at least in DC, and I'm sure the rest of you are too, about how are we changing what we do in high school so kids have more employability skills. And I know that Latifah is here from City Works, right there, and sort of we've been thinking about how can we give up some of what we're doing in high school to have kids have their last year be in internships and apprenticeships and et cetera. And I think that is the poverty interrupter that we need, along with universal pre-K.
All right, I think last question.
Hey, Josh Zubrick, TBR 1618. Since we were talking about teachers needing math preparation, I have the opportunity to work on a college campus, and we're seeing a pretty precipitous drop in teacher prep. One thing that we've noticed is that student teaching is the only internship on campus that pays less than $20 an hour, and we pay $0. And so we're trying to change that. But with Gen Z, we're just hearing anecdotally that they don't want to go into teaching. I don't have like hard facts on that, but I'm just curious, like as a systems leader, how are you thinking about our new generation and how we maybe rethink the teacher role to try to get people back in classrooms?
I will quickly just say, you're 20, 22, 23 years old. A few years ago, all the world went virtual. You're going to come and teach where you have to go in 5 days a week with no flexibility from 7 a.m. to 4 a.m. and grade at night. I mean, we have to transform what teachers do to give them some flexibility. I don't actually need a teacher to deliver from 7 to 4. I need them to deliver these courses for 90 minutes in some way. And so we, at least I know that I know others in DC are thinking about how do we bring what people are getting in other industries so that teachers have some flexibility in their work.
Right. And what I'll speak to in that space is that, you know, I love your comment around the residency and around what we call it residency now, what used to be called the old student teaching. We did have to rethink that within our parents. I mean, within our parish, and we allocated resources so that it is a paid internship now. So we have done that. And again, one thing that we're seeing in the state of Louisiana is an incredible, and it's really national, an incredible decline in your traditional education majors. Students just are not doing that. And I really believe things like the residency and that being unpaid is not helping us to increase numbers of people going into education. One thing that we're doing too, though, is this whole concept around grow your own, and we really have had to find. We have a wonderful program. We've hit our 100th teacher. We've been doing this for 5 years. Well, we were licensed by the state because of our need for certified or qualified persons to be in front of our children. Now, in that respect, we are taking persons from our community and we're growing them. We're providing them with that educational opportunity at no charge, and we're paying for this so that we are creating our own workforce. So much power in being able to train someone to go into the classrooms and to be successful with students. So those are some of the things that we're doing. But I agree with Pat 100%. If you look at opportunities within the workforce that we are most competing with, very few of them don't have some level of work flexibility, especially as we've come out of COVID. So I do think anything that we can do to create those levels of comfort within our Gen Zs and within our workforce is going to be important. One thing we have to remember too about the people that we're employing today is that they are not looking for that great government job that they will stay on for 30 years. They can't imagine staying anywhere for 5 years, much less 30. So I think how we design, support, prepare, and have that next person prepared is going to be increasingly more important.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel here, Bill, Pat, and Lamar.